History books love to paint palace life as an elegant dream, filled with sparkling crowns and infinite wealth. But behind the closed doors of the world's most famous castles, the daily reality was a circus of absolute madness. We are exploring the most hilariously strict, paranoid, and totally absurd regulations that the royal staff had to follow on a daily basis. You will never view royalty the same way. 1. Filthy lucre is certainly not just a clever metaphor if you are the head of the British monarchy. Historically, the coins circulating in public were absolutely covered in dirt, grime, and disease, which simply would not do for highly sensitive aristocratic hands. To solve this dilemma, a dedicated team of servants had a mind-numbing daily chore: washing the monarch's loose change. Every single silver and gold coin handed to the sovereign had to be meticulously scrubbed with hot water and polished until it gleamingly reflected the room's light. This obsessive cleaning ensured that whenever the royal wanted to hand out a casual tip, their royal fingers remained perfectly unsoiled. 2. Back in the Tudor era, the most prestigious job in the entire palace was quite literally dealing with human waste. The groom of the stool was a highly coveted position where an aristocrat had the supreme honor of accompanying the king to the bathroom, assisting him with his bodily functions, and yes, wiping him clean. This servant was so intimately close to the monarch that they held immense political power and often controlled the royal finances. It is the ultimate proof that kissing up to the boss has always been a viable career strategy. Would you wipe a billionaire's backside if it guaranteed you a seat at the most powerful table in the world? 3. Turning your back on a monarch was considered the ultimate sign of disrespect. To avoid this catastrophic faux pas, servants were required to exit rooms by walking entirely backwards. They had to navigate long, treacherous hallways, heavy oak doors, and footstools without breaking eye contact with the sovereign. One wrong step meant tumbling backward and humiliating yourself in front of the most powerful person in the empire. 4. Servants had to iron the daily newspaper before handing it to the monarch. Why? Because fresh ink smudges, and a king simply cannot be expected to endure the indignity of ink-stained fingertips while checking the morning headlines. 5. If you think brushing your teeth is a solo activity, you clearly lack royal status. For years, servants were tasked with squeezing exactly 1 inch of toothpaste onto the royal toothbrush every morning. If the measurement was off, or if the paste was slightly messy, it was a profound failure of duty. Imagine going to a prestigious university, securing a high-level palace job, and realizing your primary function is operating a tube of toothpaste with sniper-like precision. 6. Deep paranoia regarding dangerous witchcraft made basic palace grooming a highly classified, incredibly stressful operation. Whenever the royal barber trimmed the monarch's hair or clipped their fingernails, the discarded pieces could not simply be swept into the trash. A trusted, high-ranking servant had to carefully collect every single microscopic hair and nail clipping, place them in a secure container, and ceremoniously burn them in a private fire. The intense fear was that if a rogue peasant found a piece of royal hair, they could easily use it to cast a deadly, treasonous curse on the crown. 7. If you suffered from terrible vision in the historical royal court, you basically just had to endure it in complete blurry silence. Wearing basic eyeglasses directly in the presence of the monarch was strictly considered a deeply offensive, unforgivable insult. Glass lenses were rigidly thought to falsely alter the natural, divine appearance of the sovereign. Therefore, visually impaired servants simply had to confidently stumble around the grand palace, desperately hoping they were respectfully bowing to the actual reigning king and not just a very tall, highly decorated piece of wooden furniture. 8. Drawing a bath for a royal was a scientific endeavor that rivaled a major space launch. Servants had to use a specialized thermometer to ensure the water was exactly tepid, never a degree too hot or too cold. Furthermore, the tub had to be filled precisely halfway. A splash over the halfway mark was considered entirely unacceptable. 9. Talk about culinary roulette. Long before security cameras, kings relied on a human shield for their digestive tract. Servants were forced to eat a portion of the royal meal before it was served to ensure it wasn't spiked with arsenic. 10. Before electric blankets existed, castles were brutally drafty and freezing cold. To ensure the monarch didn't have to slip into icy sheets, a specific servant was tasked with rolling around in the royal bed for an hour before bedtime. Their sole purpose was to act as a human radiator, absorbing the cold and leaving behind a perfectly lukewarm sleeping environment. Of course, they had to vacate the premises the moment the royal arrived. It is strangely intimate, heavily awkward, and begs the question: could you fall asleep knowing someone else just spent an hour vigorously rolling around in your freshly laundered sheets? 11. Long before the miraculous invention of modern indoor plumbing, grand medieval castles smelled absolutely atrocious due to thousands of people living in close quarters. To constantly spare the sensitive royal nose, a specific group of servants had to walk directly in front of the monarch at all times, frantically scattering fresh lavender, mint, and sweet-smelling rushes onto the cold, damp stone floors. They essentially acted as frantic, breathing human air fresheners, desperately masking the overwhelming foul stench of the castle corridors with every single elegant step the king ultimately decided to take. 12. Having brand new shoes is fantastic, but getting blisters from them is a miserable inconvenience strictly reserved for peasants. To save the delicate royal feet from any agonizing friction, a designated servant with the exact same shoe size was employed solely to wear the monarch's stiff new footwear. They had to march up and down the endless palace corridors for days until the rigid leather was perfectly softened. Imagine having a professional career where your only daily deliverable is acquiring painful foot blisters on behalf of a billionaire. 13. Queen Elizabeth I famously loved deeply expensive, imported cane sugar so much that her natural teeth eventually turned completely jet black from severe, untreated decay. Because no one ever dared to directly criticize the terrifying, absolute monarch, her most loyal female servants initiated a truly bizarre, deeply unsettling cosmetic trend. They intentionally painted their own perfectly healthy teeth completely black, using highly toxic fireplace soot and finely crushed coal. They voluntarily made themselves look deeply unwell just to ensure the incredibly powerful queen never felt socially insecure about her genuinely terrible dental hygiene. 14. The grand staircases of European palaces were architectural marvels, but the staff was absolutely forbidden from enjoying the spectacular view. Servants were strictly required to walk on the extreme outer edges of the steps, directly against the handrails or the cold stone walls. The grand center of the staircase was exclusively reserved for the royal family to make their dramatic, sweeping ascents. This ridiculous rule preserved the luxurious carpet in the middle, leaving the staff to awkwardly hug the walls like frightened spiders, avoiding a heavy broom. 15. Eating fresh fruit is a remarkably simple pleasure, unless you happen to be wearing a heavy jeweled crown. Royals were completely terrified of the deep social embarrassment of accidentally spitting out a seed during a fancy public banquet. Therefore, kitchen servants had to painstakingly remove every single microscopic seed from watermelons, lemons, and grapes using tiny silver tweezers before the fruit ever reached the dining room. It was an agonizing, hours-long task requiring surgical precision to prevent a highly sensitive diplomatic disaster over a stray lemon pip. 16. You could absolutely never go to sleep before the monarch. Even if it was 3 in the morning and the king was busy aggressively discussing terrible philosophy over his 6th glass of imported wine, the household staff had to remain wide awake and fully dressed in the shadows, silently waiting. 17. If you think being a high-ranking palace chef meant exclusively cooking for sophisticated aristocrats, you clearly forgot about the royal pets. The kitchen staff was frequently required to prepare elaborate, multi-course gourmet meals specifically for the monarch's spoiled dogs. We are talking about freshly roasted rabbit, prime cuts of beef, and steamed cabbage, completely chopped into bite-sized pieces and served on antique silver platters. 18. During massive medieval banquets, cutting a roast wasn't a menial task for the kitchen staff. It was an extreme honor bestowed upon a high-ranking nobleman known as the Grand Carver. This wasn't just slicing roast beef, it was a highly theatrical martial art. The carver had to use specialized swords to chop the meat midair, perfectly catching the heavy slices on a silver skewer without ever touching the food with his bare hands. It was basically a highly dangerous medieval version of a hibachi chef's performance executed at the royal table. 19. Building a fire in a royal fireplace was a heavily regulated, almost obsessive art form. Servants could never just throw some random logs on a grate and strike a match. The firewood had to be stacked in a highly specific, mathematically precise grid pattern to ensure it burned with minimal smoke and maximum aesthetic appeal. Every single log had to be perfectly straight, meticulously stripped of any messy bark, and arranged so the flames danced symmetrically. It was a chaotic blend of high-end interior design and basic survival heating. 20. Making the reigning monarch's bed was treated with the exact same level of severity as successfully defusing a live bomb. Housekeepers had to use a long wooden ruler to mathematically measure the distance between the folded edge of the top blanket and the wooden headboard. It had to be absolutely flawless, without a single microscopic wrinkle in the heavy silk sheets. If the monarch slid into bed and felt even the slightest hidden lump, the responsible servant faced intense disciplinary action. 21. Personal boundaries were practically non-existent, but the physical space around the monarch was heavily guarded by absolute superstition. In several historical courts, servants were strictly forbidden from ever letting their own shadow cast upon the body of the reigning sovereign. It was deeply believed that a commoner's shadow carried terrible luck or illness. If the late afternoon sun was shining through the grand windows, nervous servants had to constantly calculate the light angles and physically dive out of the way just to keep their dark silhouettes away from the king. 22. Garlic is a beloved staple in most modern kitchens, but it was absolutely banned in the royal palace. Servants were explicitly forbidden from using even a single clove in any dish, simply because the monarch refused to tolerate the offensive stench of bad breath during highly important diplomatic meetings. 23. Serving piping hot soup to a hungry monarch presented a massive, highly unusual logistical problem for the palace kitchen. A common peasant's breath was strictly considered spiritually unclean, meaning the culinary staff was absolutely forbidden from ever blowing on a steaming bowl to quickly cool it down. Instead, they had to employ dedicated, specialized servants who rapidly fanned the extravagant dishes using large, exotic ostrich feathers right before the food entered the grand dining hall. It was an incredibly theatrical, heavily overcomplicated way to simply prevent the king from accidentally burning the delicate roof of his royal mouth. 24. Shielding a monarch from sudden rain was an incredibly high-stakes, deeply stressful balancing act for the working staff. The servant holding the massive, heavily decorated silk umbrella was absolutely forbidden from ever letting a single drop of water touch the royal garments. However, they were equally forbidden from ever stepping onto the expensive dry carpets meant exclusively for the king. They had to physically stretch their tired arms out to ridiculous, painful lengths, awkwardly leaning over the walking path while being completely drenched by the pouring rain themselves. 25. To announce your presence at a closed door, you normally knock, but in the French royal court, that was considered violently aggressive. Servants and wealthy nobles alike were absolutely forbidden from making a closed fist to strike the king's door. Instead, they had to actively grow out the fingernail on their pinky finger and gently scratch at the heavy wood like a polite giant cat. You had to stand there, awkwardly scraping the door, until someone inside finally noticed the faint noise. 26. The royal family's private dining room was a tense theater of absolute silence for the working staff. Footmen were required to serve enormous, elaborate feasts using a complex system of subtle nods and eye movements, because uttering a single spoken word while the monarch was eating was a strictly fireable offense. 27. If a reigning monarch accidentally let out a loud, echoing burp or a highly undignified hiccup during a massive public feast, the surrounding staff had to spring into immediate action. Servants were explicitly instructed to quickly create a loud, entirely chaotic distraction. They would intentionally drop a massive, heavy metal serving tray or loudly scrape a heavy wooden chair against the stone floor to instantly mask the embarrassing royal sound. They essentially had to purposefully make themselves look wildly incompetent in front of hundreds of noble guests just to fiercely protect the king's fragile public dignity. 28. Royal hands were considered almost miraculously divine, meaning the working staff had to treat basic physical contact exactly like handling toxic hazardous waste. If a lowly servant was required to directly hand a document or a personal item to the reigning monarch, they had to strictly wear pristine, brand-new white cotton gloves. These expensive gloves could absolutely never be reused. Once the incredibly brief interaction was over, the gloves were immediately discarded and thrown straight into a fire. The monarchy literally destroyed perfectly good clothing every single day just to successfully avoid touching anything a regular citizen had briefly touched. 29. Taking home delicious leftover food from your modern job is usually a nice little perk, but historical royal servants turned it into an extreme, utterly cutthroat competition. Any half-eaten, casually discarded food left directly on the monarch's personal dinner plate was strangely considered deeply blessed. High-ranking aristocratic servants would aggressively fight over the supreme honor of eating the king's partially chewed bread crusts or cold leftover meat scraps. It is completely wild to think that enthusiastically eating your arrogant boss's literal table garbage was once considered a massive, highly respected career milestone. 30. Forget your standard digital alarm clocks. Queen Victoria initiated a truly bizarre tradition that required a highly trained, fully uniformed musician to stand directly under her bedroom window at exactly 8 o'clock every single morning and violently blast the bagpipes for 15 solid minutes. This deafening, inescapable musical serenade remarkably remains a strict morning requirement for the royal staff to this very day. 31. To protect King Henry VIII from invisible assassins, his bedmakers could not just casually fluff his luxurious pillows. After perfectly smoothing out the massive feather mattress, the exhausted servants were forced to physically kiss every single pillow, bedsheet, and heavy blanket. This incredibly bizarre evening ritual was called the assay, and it was specifically designed to prove the royal linens had not been secretly dusted with a deadly medieval poison. Imagine your nightly bedtime routine involving your entire housekeeping staff thoroughly kissing your blankets just to guarantee you actually wake up the next morning. 32. Natural human bodily functions were essentially outlawed in the immediate presence of the sovereign. If a dedicated servant was standing silently on guard during a 3-hour banquet and suddenly felt a rogue sneeze or a scratchy cough building up in their throat, they had to absolutely stifle the urge or frantically sprint completely out of the royal chambers. Sneezing, coughing, or even aggressively clearing your throat near the reigning monarch was considered a horrifying, unforgivable breach of basic court etiquette. It could easily result in an immediate, deeply disgraceful dismissal from your glamorous palace life entirely. 33. Successfully waking up. A deeply sleeping monarch was a highly dangerous, incredibly stressful daily morning mission. You could absolutely never just shake their shoulder or loudly call out their name, as abruptly startling the sovereign was a severely punishable, treasonous offense. Instead, a highly designated, terrified servant had to silently approach the massive bed and gently tickle the royal cheeks with a long, incredibly soft ostrich feather until the sleepy ruler peacefully opened their eyes. 34. The simple act of casually taking a seat was a strictly regulated privilege, not a basic human right. If a royal confidently walked into a massive library or a grand drawing room, every single servant, armed guard, and lesser noble had to instantly stand rigidly up. More bizarrely, servants were completely banned from ever sitting in any chair that a monarch might eventually decide to use. If you were utterly exhausted after a 12-hour shift, you basically had to collapse on the hard stone floor. Could you realistically survive a grueling job where taking a 5-minute seat could literally get you thrown directly in the dungeon? 35. Painting a majestic royal portrait was an incredibly torturous, mind-numbing waiting game for the surrounding household staff. Because a wealthy king simply could not be expected to manually hold a heavy, jeweled gold scepter in the air for 5 straight hours, A dedicated servant dressed in entirely dark, camouflaged clothing had to silently crouch directly behind the massive throne. Their entire exhaustive job was to physically hold the heavy gold props perfectly in place, essentially acting as an invisible, breathing human kickstand while the famous artist slowly completed their masterpiece. 36. A steep staircase was apparently way too physically exhausting for some heavily robed monarchs to safely handle alone. When navigating particularly tight, narrow spiral stairs inside massive medieval stone towers, servants had to physically push the monarch directly from behind. They essentially acted as a struggling human escalator, placing their bare hands squarely on the royal back and aggressively shoving the ruler up the stairs to safely save them the intense leg workout. How exactly do you respectfully shove the most powerful person in the country without making it look like a physical assault? 37. We already know about traditional royal food tasters, but the Tudor court took extreme poison paranoia to an entirely different, incredibly theatrical level. The high-ranking servant in charge of the royal bakery did not just have to eat a small piece of dinner roll. They were strictly required to physically kiss the grand dining tablecloth, the elaborately folded napkins, and the massive wooden cutting boards before the king even sat down to eat. It was a highly dramatic, entirely superstitious performance meant to magically absorb any hidden, lethal toxins stubbornly lingering on the dining table setup. 38. Serving breakfast for a royal is an absolute masterclass in extreme, entirely unnecessary food waste. Because monarchs often refuse to specify exactly how soft they want their boiled egg in the morning, the kitchen staff has to simultaneously boil dozens of eggs to slightly different consistencies. They are all lined up mathematically, so when the king finally decides he wants a precise 3.5-minute egg, a nervous servant can instantly produce the exact match. The rest of the perfectly good edible food is immediately thrown straight into the palace garbage. 39. Transporting royal human waste was actually treated with the exact same solemn, ceremonial reverence as handling the sacred crown jewels. When a desperate servant finally had to empty the monarch's personal chamber pot, they were absolutely forbidden from simply carrying it down the dark back hallway like a normal bucket. The foul pot had to be dramatically draped in a luxurious, heavily gold-embroidered velvet cloth, completely hiding the unsightly vessel from public view. It is hilariously weird to think about someone marching proudly down a grand corridor, majestically carrying a highly decorated, velvet-covered bucket of human waste. 40. In several historic European courts, successfully going to sleep was not as simple as just closing your heavy eyes. Exhausted monarchs actively employed specific, highly specialized servants whose sole, incredibly bizarre daily duty was to sit quietly at the very end of the massive mattress and gently tickle the bare soles of the royal feet until the ruler finally drifted off to sleep. This rhythmic, gentle scratching was considered the ultimate, elite aristocratic relaxation technique of the era. Honestly, how much money would someone actually have to pay you to be a professional, nighttime royal foot tickler? 41. Feeding the royal pets was never just throwing some cheap kibble into a plastic bowl. The monarch's beloved dogs had a highly specific, unbreakable social hierarchy that the staff had to memorize perfectly. Servants were strictly required to serve the oldest, most senior dogs first, moving down the line to the youngest puppies. Furthermore, the meals had to be served on pristine silver platters and completely hand-delivered by the royal butler. If a junior servant accidentally fed a younger dog before an older one, it was considered a massive insult to the royal household's entire social order. 42. Dropping an item on the floor is a minor annoyance for most of us, but for a royal servant, it was a sudden trap. If a maid accidentally dropped a silver spoon or a sweeping brush while the monarch was in the room, they were absolutely forbidden from simply bending over to pick it up. They had to leave the item on the floor and pretend it did not exist until the royal finally left the room. Bending over awkwardly in the presence of the sovereign was deemed highly undignified and completely inappropriate for the palace aesthetic. 43. In several highly paranoid historical eras, every single piece of incoming mail delivered to the palace had to be thoroughly ironed by the staff before ever reaching the royal desk. The extreme heat was deeply believed to instantly kill any hidden diseases carried by the dirty commoners who previously handled the paper. Imagine being a highly trained palace official, and your absolute primary defense against a deadly national plague is just a hot laundry iron. 44. Cleaning the massive castle moat was historically the absolute worst job on the entire estate, but it came with a highly specific, unbreakable scheduling mandate. The miserable servants tasked with shoveling out the deeply accumulated waste were strictly known as gong farmers, and they were legally only allowed to work during the pitch-black, freezing hours of the deep night. The wealthy royals absolutely refused to look out their grand stained-glass windows and see common peasants dealing with horrific trash, so these unfortunate workers functioned entirely like deeply tragic, completely unseen, nocturnal castle ghosts. 45. Queen Victoria's devastating grief over Prince Albert was so profound that it spawned a deeply unsettling daily ritual for her staff. Long after he tragically passed away, maids were strictly ordered to enter his private bedroom every single morning. They had to lay out a fresh, perfectly pressed outfit on his bed and bring up a basin of steaming hot water for his morning shave, exactly as if he were still alive. This phantom routine continued without interruption for 40 solid years. Would you be able to keep a straight face while serving hot water to a literal ghost? 46. Traveling for a long vacation is stressful, but imagine having to pack an entire wooden bedroom. When a medieval monarch traveled across the country, they entirely refused to sleep in strange, uncomfortable tavern beds. Instead, a massive team of exhausted servants had to rapidly dismantle the king's enormous, heavy oak bed frame, load it onto horse-drawn wagons, and rebuild it flawlessly at the very next destination. They repeated this grueling carpentry routine every single day of the royal tour, essentially acting as a medieval high-speed moving company for a single piece of furniture. 47. In many palaces, maids were treated less like employees and more like architectural ghosts. If a royal walked down the hallway, a servant sweeping or dusting had to immediately drop everything, face the wall, and become completely unnoticed. You were not allowed to make eye contact, offer a greeting, or even acknowledge their presence. It was basically an extreme, high-stakes version of freeze tag, where the penalty for moving was losing your livelihood. 48. Maintaining a cheerful attitude is standard customer service today, but historically, royal servants had to become completely emotionless human robots. They were strictly forbidden from displaying any genuine facial expressions while on official duty. If the king told an incredibly hilarious, roaring joke to his wealthy friends at the dinner table, a footman standing nearby could not even crack a tiny smile. Conversely, if a servant was having a terrible, heartbreaking day, they could not show a single hint of sadness. They were required to be completely blank, living pieces of moving furniture. 49. Touching the monarch was strictly considered high treason, which created absolutely hilarious and dangerous paradoxes for the working staff. If the king tripped on a loose carpet and was about to fall face first onto the hard stone floor, a nearby servant could not simply reach out and catch him. Doing so would mean placing uninvited dirty commoner hands on the sacred royal body, which was a severely punishable offense. You literally had to stand there, helplessly watch the most powerful man in the country eat dirt, and desperately hope he did not execute you for your mandatory inaction. All right, we have covered 49 bizarre rules, and only one final item is left. But before number 50, it is time for our final verdict. The award for the absolute dumbest rule undeniably goes to item 13. Willingly painting your perfectly healthy teeth pitch black with toxic fireplace soot just because the queen ate too much sugar and ruined her own smile is the absolute peak of historical idiocy. Do you agree, or did another insane rule steal the show? Let us know in the comments. And now, our final number. 50. Your morning physical exam was a deeply uncomfortable public spectacle. Every single morning, a highly trusted aristocratic servant had the incredibly gross responsibility of carefully examining the monarch's freshly produced urine in a clear glass flask. They had to hold the warm vessel directly up to the sunlight, intensely study its exact color, check for unusual cloudiness, and sometimes even smell it to diagnose the royal health for the day. It was the ultimate highly invasive medical checkup, performed right in the middle of the bedroom. It turns out that historical luxury completely relied on an army of exhausted workers following the most ridiculously specific, paranoid rules ever created. Before you go, tell me in the comments, do you think modern billionaires secretly have rules just as weird as these? Thank you for watching, and remember to hit that subscribe button if you want more fascinating historical absurdity.